At the end of the day, it's not about what you have or even what you've accomplished. It's about what you've done with those accomplishments. It's about who you've lifted up, who you've made better. It's about what you've given back. Denzel Washington. Welcome to Inspire Vision. Our sole purpose is to elevate the lives of others and to inspire you to do the same.
Constantin, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Doug. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here. I know that you have a fascinating story about how you reached the point of where you're at, and I'd love for you to share with the audience that story, and even going back to when you were in Russia and those type of things.
Sounds good. Absolutely, Doug. So actually, I was born in Romania, which is
Romania, okay,
west of Russia. Of course, still at some point had a lot of influence from Russia. And of course, when I was born, the country was a communist country for the first 7 years of my life, which meant that it was a time of scarcity, a time of fear, a time of not having a lot of opportunity. So the influences that I had on me as a child, even though my parents, my caregivers were looking to protect me and to give me the best, but the influences were, unfortunately, a lot of them were negative, right? A lot of limiting beliefs, a lot of fixed mindset type influences from people that didn't know they could do more or they could challenge the status quo. And I've always been someone that looked up at things, and if something didn't make sense, I wanted to challenge it. And of course, they got me into a lot of hot waters, so to speak, over my life.
And so, yeah, go on.
I was going to say, the story, we'll fast forward to about 3 years ago, because that's when things really started to shift a lot. Now, I came to Canada, at 17, with my family. We didn't speak any English. We immigrated here for a better life. And then I went to school here, followed in the footsteps of my parents, were both engineers. I went down the sciences side, and I just did my thing. I did both entrepreneurial adventures and been part of the corporate world for quite a while. However, how life will have it, you know how when you go down a path and you finally realize, why am I even doing this? And that's what I was, because I was following a path that was pretty much influenced by everyone else except me.
Yeah.
I listened to my parents. I wanted to listen to the ones that knew, people outside of you. And then you wake up one day and you realize that, yes, you have the American dream, you have the success, you have everything you want in life, except the most important things, which for me were joy, happiness, and fulfillment.
Well, and it's interesting, isn't it, how we all, and I'm in the same boat. I've got 4 brothers, and I guarantee you, every one of them went into the profession that they went into, to some degree because of their interest, but major because my dad told us, number 1, you will all be professionals, and number 2, I'm not going to help you.
Yes. And I mean, that's what I'm seeing as well. And what I do today is help people that have gone down this path to find what it is in their heart, what it is that they want to do, and define success on their own terms, because society has done a great job at defining success for us. And I would imagine your father and my parents and everyone else's parents listening to this, they only wanted the best for you, right? So
yes.
This is what would amount to success. And you didn't know any better, so you followed in their footsteps. Now, some people didn't have those opportunities, so some went a different way. But right now, we're at a point in time when there are so many opportunities, but if you don't start looking at who you are below the indoctrination, below the lessons and stories of society and caregivers and whatnot, you're not going to find that fulfillment, the joy, the happiness, the satisfaction that you're looking for, because you're chasing someone else's dream.
Well, and that's so true. And, whether it's someone else's society, whoever, but it's interesting how that ego gets in the way. And, as we talk about success, my experience has been, as I talk to people about success, most of it is ego driven. And I sense that that's not what you're talking about. So when you define success, what do you mean? Because I think that can be a universal element for anyone, regardless of their financial situation, their education, or whatever that happens to be.
Yeah. You see, languages fascinate me, Doug. And I mean, English was a language I didn't speak much of when I came to Canada, so I had to learn it all from the ground up. And what I've realized throughout my life is that we tend to give definitions to words, and whatever the mainstream defines the word as, that's what we stick by. So then we have words that have negative connotations almost always, even though they're not necessarily meant to be that way. And success is one of those words that when someone hears success, they immediately have a picture in their mind of what it looks like. And that's usually defined by someone outside of them, and partially by ego, like you mentioned, because mine was no different. For me, success looked like, oh, I'm going to get a degree, I'm going to be a successful business owner, which I was, or join the corporate world, which I did, and climb up the corporate ladder, make a lot of money, have the shiny toys. That was success looked like to me. And if you look at it, that's mostly ego driven because it's material based, right?
Right.
It's not like the quality of your relationships, the quality of your self-care and self-talk, the quality of your environment. None of that stuff matters when we're looking at success from the outside and how most people and society define it. So to me, success these days is like, okay, what is it in my heart that I want to achieve? I call it my purpose, my mission in life, my why. Many people have different versions of it. And everything that I do, if it's aligned with that, that means it's successful. So last week I had a 4-hour masterclass on calm success, so achieving peak performance without any of the pressure that's usually associated with it. For me, the event was successful because at the end of the 4 hours, and even throughout it, people were having transformations left and right. They were coming off of mute, sharing in the chat how this is shifting beliefs, how this is impacting them. For me, that's success. There was no look at like, oh, how many of them signed up to be clients? How many of them paid me anything? This was an event that was $7 and people got transformed, including myself, because I've learned so much in the process. And now that's success for me. Like if I can impact someone's life, that's success. And how do you...
So I'm curious, as you got to that point, because I know you were very successful, as you say, both in your own business as well as corporate. What were the elements that finally reached you and helped you to become aware enough that you were able to say to yourself, you know what, this is not what I really want, this is not who I really am? What were those elements that finally caused you to have that awakening?
That's a great question, Doug. And for me, it was back in 2021, coming out of the pandemic, having worked 60 plus hours a week in my corporate job, in a very fulfilling job, because I was enabling people to work from home during the pandemic, but still 60 plus hours. My entire identity was my job, to the point that everything I did outside of it was escaping the reality. So you know how when you wake up, you're like, oh, I got to go to work. So you dread waking up, but then you go to work, you work 10, 12 hours, however long it is, plus the commute. And then you come home and you are like, well, I don't have time to cook healthy. I don't even have the energy. I don't have time to spend any minutes with my loved ones. I'm just going to order some takeout, play some computer games, watch some Netflix, and then wait till the weekend to hope to catch up on sleep so I can do more things. And that was my life for, I don't know, probably like 6-7 years up to that point. And I've realized that working hard for success and sacrificing my well-being, sacrificing my relationship, sacrificing pretty much everything I hold dear to me was no longer an option, because it was an awakening moment. It's like, wow, I just recently got a promotion at that point, more money, about the same responsibility. And I was like, this doesn't do anything for me anymore. It's like I worked so hard for the promotion, and then it was a rude awakening call, right? Because you're like, oh, I want this shiny thing, and then you get a shiny thing, and you're like, yes. So that was, I would say, the biggest pivotal moment in my life.
And I know that you developed something called the 3 foundational pillars. Can you go through those step by step and talk about how do they apply to someone's transformation? And as you talk about, your own transformation story, what do you really mean by transformation? Let's get into that first.
Oh, I love that. And I'm picking up some papers here because I presented this last week at my event, right? And it's very fresh in my mind. But transformation for me means looking at your own life if you are unhappy with anything in your life, and most of us have one or two things that we're not happy with, and the people I serve, high achievers, many of them listening to your show right now, these are people that have seen some success in life. It doesn't matter if it's in the corporate world, if it's as an entrepreneur, or maybe you're an artist or an athlete. It doesn't really matter. You've seen success in your life, but it almost always came with a sacrifice of sorts. So you might have the successful business, but you work 60 hours a week and your relationships are falling apart, and your self-care is in the gutter because you don't have time for it nor the energy. Or you have the success, you have the successful business, you have all the money in the world, but you don't have the relationships you would want because nobody understands what you're going through. You have everything on the outside, so why would anyone empathize with your lack of fulfillment or lack of joy or lack of clarity or lack of happiness, right? So that's what I would say, that's where transformation starts. You know that something isn't aligned, isn't working for you in your life, and you want to get to a different place. So the process of getting from point A, so being too busy, overwhelmed, stressed, burnt out, depressed, anxious, all of those things, that's the starting state. Through some system and process, you're going to end up in the next step, which is essentially what I would take people, or I help people get to, which is a state where you stress less, achieve more, and create time for what you love without any of the usual sacrifices. You don't sacrifice what you care about. And that's what I would call a transformation, right? You go from point A to point B where it's tangible, but it's aligned with who you are.
Well, and as you say, it's something that, once achieved, all of a sudden it's just a remarkable life experience that you can have. Let me ask you a question. I did a podcast just last week, and we were talking about values and how often we find ourselves doing things that really don't connect with what our true values are. In fact, I think a lot of times people just don't think about their values, and what is my real value. We were talking about using, and I'm sure in the corporate world you've heard of the DISC test and some of those where you're using those to hire people or understand their personality. And we were talking about that and talking about the fact that in this particular one that we used, it really goes in and helps to identify what people's values are. In other words, they're responding to the evaluation, but they're really clarifying what their values are. And so often their values are not matching their behavior, what they're doing in profession or in life or whatever. What have you found? How do people, number one, discover what their true values are? And then number two, how do they correlate that in their life to where they are really now living their values?
Oh, what a beautiful question there, Doug. And that kind of also ties into your previous question that we haven't had a chance to look at, which is those 3 pillars or the 5 steps in my system.
Yes.
Because that's a crucial part to it. And when I look at values right now, I was in the same boat you just explained. Is I wasn't clear on who I was and what I valued in life. And my values are actually tied to the external world, meaning that I just picked from people that I admired, perhaps, and I said, oh, that's my value. And in most cases, it was an okay value, but at the same time, there were many scenarios in which that value was something that I wanted to be, not something that I was. And when you're talking about values, it's who you are at your core versus who you
Yes.
were. And that's where most people make a mistake, me included, where you're like, oh, I want to be this person, so that's my value. Well, it's not yet your value. Yes, you can pull it from the future into your present, but there are some steps you have to take, because then we have this false idea that we are something that we're not, and then our life is going to reflect that, the not, and then we're going to wonder where the disconnect is. So
Yes.
what's done with my system, when I looked at so I mentioned to you that 2021 was when I finally realized I was going down the wrong path. And at this point, I was investing a lot in my personal and professional development. I mean, I at the time I was working for Microsoft, and in a very, very senior role, I was successful, but I had to compete against many high achievers. So I invested a lot in my own personal development, but it was always external. What I had realized at that moment is that I have to start looking internally. I have to pull back the curtain and realize that I have been suppressing emotions and feelings all my life, and some of my foundational pillars were not very strong, including the one you just mentioned around values, around who I am at the core level, at the heart level. And when I look at my journey, I didn't actually start what I should have started because I didn't know any better. And I started at what I would call the second step. Are you familiar with a gentleman by the name of Simon Sinek? He's a motivation.
I'm not. No, I'm not.
Okay. Some people in the audience maybe. He's fairly popular. He has a book called, he has many books, but one of them is called Start With Why. And that's a book I read maybe a decade ago now. And it was really, really powerful because it told you essentially to get within and find out who you are at the core and start with that purpose, start with the why. And that's what I finally did back in 2021, 2022. But what I hadn't realized is that, like most people listening here, when you read the books, you watch the podcast, you listen to the videos or watch the videos, and you start implementing things in your life, they don't always work out the way you'd expect them to work, even though they worked really well for someone else. And then you end up blaming yourself, and then you go look for the next shiny object and you try to implement that, and that's going to fail again. Well, I was the same. What happened there is I didn't realize that the most important aspect of us as human beings is our foundation. And what I mean by foundation, Doug, it's your psychology, your thoughts and beliefs about yourself, about others, and about the world at large. Because you see, on top of the foundation comes the mindset, comes who you are, and how you're going to show up to the world. Because if you don't have a solid foundation, so your belief system, your thought patterns are not in line with who you are and who you want to be, everything's going to fall apart at some point because you get storms in your life. You may lose a job. You maybe get passed on for a promotion. You may lose a life partner because they decide to move on from you. You may lose a loved one. Like, things happen that are outside of your control. And when those happen, they will bring down the house of cards really quickly. And you now are starting back at square one. And that's what I was time and time again, despite my success.
Well, and so as you talk about those three foundational pillars, and I know that we were going to start there, and then I kept asking you different questions. But how did you come up with those three foundational pillars? And then we're going to talk about each one specifically, if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way it all came up to me is that I simply went through life, and as a high achiever, I was like, I need to figure this out. You know, as a high achiever, you go in and you're like, well, I'm smart. I've done many things. I'm not going to bother other people. I'm going to do it all myself. And that's what I did. So instead of going out and saying, hey, you know what, put my hand up, I need some help. Help me in this area, I decided to do it all myself. So that's why it took me years instead of taking me months. Had I had the system I'm going to talk to you about right now. And the way I discovered it is simply reading books, listening to podcasts like yours, watching videos, and trying things in my life. And as I mentioned, I started with what I would call the second pillar of my system, which is that why, that purpose, that mission. I call it the peak clarity system aspect of it because it's all about getting clear on who you are. That includes your values, right? That includes
yes,
all aspects of who you are. And I started there. And I remember finally figuring it out. And I'm like, oh, this is amazing. But I did nothing with it for about 6 to 7 months because it also coincided to be the worst time of my life in terms of my mental health. I was depressed, suicidal. I was working 60 hours plus a week. And I was like, I don't know what to do with this. I found it, but now what? And then fast forward about 6, 7 months. This is beginning of 2023, so last year now. And I realized, wait a second, what's really holding me back is essentially these thought patterns I would get into, or my beliefs, like maybe I'm not good enough, that imposter syndrome that kicks in, that fear of failure, the fear of success that creeps up occasionally. And I realized that after reading and watching a lot of psychology-related material, because psychology has been my passion all my life, the way we interact with people, the way we talk, the way we do things. So I dove deep into neuroscience. And at the time, there was a lot of research coming out on neuroplasticity, your ability to rewire the brain and whatnot. And I stumbled upon one of my mentors that I work with right now, Jason McLennan III, who is all about something called neuroencoding, which is the language of your nervous system. It has a basis in neuroscience with NLP and hypnotherapy and a bunch of other things. And it's the idea of rewiring your brain, rewiring your thoughts and beliefs about self, others, and the world to be able to build this strong foundation so then it can withhold anything you want to build on top of it. So think of it as I had a foundation for a 2-story home, but I wanted to build a skyscraper on it. So you can imagine what happens when you start doing that.
Oh, yeah.
So, Doug, I guess to bring it all back, I started with step number 2. It took me 7 months or so to realize that step number 1 was missing. Went back, figured out step number 1. That took me, again, months to learn it all. And then I realized once my foundation started to get solid, it only took weeks for it to really see big impact. Everything else just flowed from there. And so the first part, I would say the first pillar, the biggest one, is the foundation. The second pillar is that identity of yours and getting very clear on it, and then amplifying what I would call your gifts and strengths. Because I'm not sure about you, Doug, but anyone listening to this, if I ask you the question, here's a piece of paper, you have 5 minutes, write down what your gifts are and write down what your strengths are. How many people can do that? Everyone I talk to, from my clients to friends to acquaintances, very few people can answer that question more than just like, oh, I know a couple of things I'm really good at. But no one actually spent the time to realize what it is that sets them apart from others, what it is that they are great at, because it's very hard for you as a human being to really see how amazing you are, your greatness.
Well, and I think, as you talk about that, what comes to my mind is the ego comes in and plays an extremely invalid and unfortunate role in that because, if you ask me, what are your strengths? What are your gifts? First thing years ago that would have come into my mind was, I'm a great dentist. I'm really good at diagnosing and so on and so forth. But what that is that's not who I am. That is what I do. And and I love this whole concept of being versus doing, and the ego comes into that when you say, well, what are your gifts or what are your strengths? Well, this is what I do, and this is what I do, and therefore I'm really good at that. Versus, as you're saying, really figuring out internally, really talking about the beingness I am. What are those gifts and what are those strengths? And you're right, not a lot of people are able to really sit down and identify that.
Yes, and I love what you just said there because you're 150,000% right, because I was the same way, right? You look at life, like what I do is my identity. It could be that you're a father or a mother and that's what your identity. It could be that you have a job, like you said, in your field and that's your identity. That was me too. And no judgment, that's most of us. But when you realize, when you go below the surface, there are some gifts, and I truly believe that each of us were born with a unique set of gifts that we brought into this life with. And we may have a bit of an overlap, but they are unique to me. And the strengths could be the tools and techniques you've discussed a bit, which is like, I've decided to go down this path because that's what my parents told me. And in the process, in my case, for example, I learned how to code. I learned how to do project management, organizational change management. Those are strengths that I learned along the way, but it's not who I am. And the reason that part is so important, Doug, is that there's a lot of research out there now that has taken different groups of people and had them either focus on their gifts and strengths or focus on their weaknesses, as in like spending time to improve those two. And you see results now everywhere that spending time to just be in your what's called your zone of genius, like what you're really good at, and doubling down on your strengths and your gifts is going to yield you significantly bigger return on investment than anything else you do, right? So your weaknesses, if you spend too much time on them, they're going to take time away from you spending time on what you're really good at. And guess what? If you spend time in what you're good at, your gifts and your strengths, once you identify them, it's also a place where you're going to find more joy, fulfillment, and satisfaction. Because if you're good at something, almost always there is some form of fulfillment or pleasure around it. Now, I want to preface this that it's not always the case if you're coming from the ego, like you mentioned, meaning that if we have that false sense of what we're good at, and it's all ego driven, then of course, it's going to be a bit of fakeness around it. But once you get clear on what it is that you're really good at, if you're really good at spending time with people like you are, Doug, and asking amazing questions, why would you not want to spend more time doing that and getting even better and better at it? Because it's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. My aha moment in that was I grew up with a father who was just an amazing classical voice teacher. Ended up teaching at Northwestern University, which is one of the top universities there, and he was very ego driven. As I look at it now, we lived in a house that I knew he couldn't afford. Everything was really ego driven for him, and at least that was my perception. And to some degree, it was probably true for a while. And when he passed away back in 2010, they actually held a memorial service for him at Northwestern University, and he was 92 at that point in time. But what was fascinating is as the students got up and started talking and sharing experiences and so forth, I walked out of there with tears in my eyes because I heard a different message than I really anticipated I was going to hear. I heard, oh yeah, Norman was a great voice teacher, and they'd tell stories about he'd come down to the opera, but he really hated the opera, but he was a classical voice teacher. He'd sit in the corner and raise his hands very gently when he needed to guide them on something. But their message was, yeah, he was a great teacher, but more importantly, and they told some interesting stories about this, he gave us the will to win, to love, to succeed. And I walked out of there thinking, holy cow, my dad, even though, I had assumed that there was some ego-driven things about that, somewhere along the line, that genuine gift and strength that he had came through. And he touched his students in a way that probably most college professors would never be able to touch their students, because he was being genuine in really helping them to learn to love, to succeed, to win in their lives. And for me, that was the aha moment that changed my whole perception of who I was and who I really, truly wanted to become.
Oh, that's such a beautiful story. And it reminds me of a quote. I don't know who said this, but it's something that's like, people will remember how you made them feel first and foremost before anything else. And that's what you're talking about there, right? Because those students were made to feel a certain way. They were empowered, they were inspired, they were motivated to be able to be themselves and be able to grow. And that's such a huge testament to your father and what he did.
Well, and I think for everyone, they can achieve that, as you talk about. So number one is really clarifying your drive, your vision, your why. That's your first foundational pillar, if I understand that correctly.
That's step number two, I would say, because
that's number two.
First step is that those thoughts and beliefs about yourself, others, and the world, because that's what defines really how you start. I mean, you can say that the why, that vision, and of course the values and all that are part of the foundation, but I would say this is like a layer below, because if your thoughts or patterns of belief are that I cannot do this because I'm A, B, or C, right? I'm too white, I'm too black, I'm too fat, I'm too skinny, I'm not rich enough, I'm not in the right category, right? If that's your belief, and that's going to hold you back from being able to even do anything with your why, if you know it, or your gifts and strengths, right? And will even prevent you from being clear on those, because your beliefs and your thought patterns are holding you back from realizing the amazing potential that you hold. And I truly believe that every human being has infinite potential. It's just that our thoughts and beliefs, our ego, are holding us back. So unless we get to start there, then what we do after, it's not going to yield the same results, right? You may see some success because, again, I've been successful, you've been successful, many people are successful, but at what cost, right? And if you start there, you start to see the effect. Sorry, go ahead.
So it's really achieving that consciousness, that mindset, and being able to identify those those beliefs, those subconscious things that come out. And then, okay, I appreciate what you're saying there. And then you can start working on the why. And that's number two. And then number three is really more about your gifts and strengths.
Exactly. So I broke it down into 5 steps now, so it's a bit more clear.
Okay.
Right. The first one is a foundation. Now, if let's say you and I work together, right? The way we start is we start with the foundation, but that's actually a pillar that once you start with it, you're going to see that like an onion, layers and layers will keep coming off, and you're going to work on it for the rest of your life, because your vision, which is step number 4, we'll talk about it in a second, will grow and grow, right? Because the more you accomplish, the more you realize you can do anything you want. And the more you can do anything you want, the more you're going to do, and the more you're going to be, which means that, let's say you start with the one-story home as an example here, and then eventually your vision is that you want to have this skyscraper that's like 10 stories high, maybe 20, right? Your foundation then needs to grow with you to be able to sustain whatever it is that you're trying to build on top of it.
Yes.
So this step is the first, but it's also the step that carries out throughout the entire process that we were together and your entire life as you move through it. Now, step number 2 is getting clear on your why. Because now if you have that foundation and we're working on those limiting beliefs, we're instilling new beliefs. So using neuroplasticity, right? Using neuroscience, psychology, backed methods. You start to build that. Now you have trust in yourself. You start to eliminate things like imposter syndrome, self-doubt, hesitation, procrastination, fear of failure, fear of success, self-loathing, all these things that hold you back start to get eliminated. Now your why starts to appear out of your own stories. So in other words, we're looking internally, not externally, to find out who you are, not who you want to be. And as you do that, the gifts and strengths begin to reveal themselves. So the idea here, Doug, is that let's say you and I did this process together. We would sit down and you would bring stories from your life, and we would dig into those stories to get to the stuff below the surface. Because when any of us recount a story, we usually only stay at the surface level. We want to get down to the feelings level, the feelings for you and the feelings for those involved in the situation. And they will start to show patterns. And those patterns, if you look at enough stories, which are usually about 7, 8 stories, maybe 10, you start to see that there are different buckets that start to show up. And those will give you a glimpse into who you are at the core level. Like what your gifts are, what your talents are, what your strengths are. And from there, you can pull out your why very, very easily. Now, for example, mine, when I went through my exercise, and it's something that evolves all the time, is to inspire and empower individuals on their life journey so they too can find joy, fulfillment, success, abundance in life, and make the world a better place. And ultimately, it's about inspiring and empowering people to shine their light. And that's how I look at mine. And then, so once you have your why, let's look at the gifts and strengths and amplify them. Because you said something so beautiful earlier. I mean, there's so many amazing things, but one of them that stuck up with me is that doing versus being. The why is being. The gifts and strengths is being. The doing comes after. The doing is, okay, so how do I take my why and my gifts and strengths and do something with them? So I'm going to do a podcast, like in my case, right? I'm going to be a podcast guest. I'm going to host master classes. I'm going to coach people. I'm going to mentor people. I'm going to speak on public stages, you name it. That's how I do things, or what I do versus who I am.
Well, and it's interesting. I smile because what comes to my mind immediately, I used to get in real trouble once in a while when I was at church and they were, going into some kind of lesson. And occasionally I'd raise my hand when they were just talking about you need to do this and you need to do that. And I'd raise my hand, and obviously, well, not obviously, but you'll understand I am Christian. And I would raise my hand and say, I've got a question here for everyone. Did Christ do what he did so he could become Christ, or did he do what he did because he was Christ? And, people would look at me and, I'd get all sorts of stares. But the reality is, and I think you just hit on it so well, our behavior, our actions, our doing is merely a reflection of the level of our becoming.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my God. I love it so much, Doug. Oh my God, that's amazing. And I couldn't agree more with that, because what's happening is we have this illusion from society, perhaps from the way we grew up, that we gotta hustle, right? We gotta work hard. We gotta do all these things before we can be something. When it's really the other way around. You be it first, then you do it.
Yes.
And that's why it brings us to so beautiful, the next part of my system. This is the vision aspect. I call it a dynamic vision. And in other words, it's about designing a vision worthy of your life. So seeing yourself, who you are, at some point in time, and then pulling from that into your present moment. And again, we can use science here because everything I talk about, everything I do is backed by science, neuroscience, psychology. Bruce Lipton, I'm not sure if you're familiar, a scientist that's also very spiritual in nature, he was able to show how whenever you're thinking about something or bringing up a belief or anything, usually there's a picture associated with it, right? So you may have something based on what you're seeing in your mind's eye. Your body, so your brain releases a chemical stack that then matches or mirrors whatever you're thinking, right? So if you're always thinking how bad things are, if you're always imagining that, you can't achieve something, you can't do something, that's exactly what your body is going to mirror. And then, of course, your experience externally are going to mirror that, because how can you get something that you're not? Right.
We're creating the frequency. We're creating I'm sorry to interrupt you there. But we're creating that frequency. And I love how you explain how the body just becomes a frequency that we then attract. It's like magnets. And so we will attract the frequency that we give out. And as you say, and it's amazing to me how I observe people who constantly are victims and are constantly victims, and the next week they have another experience and they're a victim. And yet, on the other hand, people who are really manifesting a positive experience in their lives, you can see that they're really consciously doing that. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
I'll interrupt whenever you want. This is a beautiful conversation, and you're 100% right, because I've been in the same spot too, playing the victim mentality, because if you look at society, that's what is promoted. And there's a good reason why it's promoted. I mean, from a marketing point of view, you can say people are evil and they're preying on us because they're promoting all this negativity and divisiveness and all that stuff. But it really goes below that, because there's something called negativity bias that's pre-built in all of us human beings for a really good reason, because up to 60, 70 years ago, it wasn't very safe out there for us. So regardless of if you believe we've been alive for 10,000 years or less or 1,000,000 years, you realize that we have been safer for a very small amount of time, which means that our brains and our physiology hasn't had a chance to adapt to the new ways of the world. So anything negative will make its way to you much, much faster than anything positive, because it's easy to take a look at an example in our lives from before. Like, you're sitting with your tribe around a campfire, and then all of a sudden a pack of lions jumps out and starts attacking people. If you're just enjoying the moment and you're just focusing on the positivity of having fun with your tribe, you're going to get eaten. And of course, your gene doesn't get passed on. So the negativity has to hit you first, so you can start doing something with it, so you can react, you can go into that, flight, freeze, fight mode and do something. So that means that in today's society where social media is so prevalent, right? Like, bad news is so easy to get a hold of, we start to get into a pattern where all we see is the negative, which means that if we want to see the positive, that's something that we need to train. It's not something that's just going to magically happen. Sure, if you've had an amazing upbringing, you had some amazing mentors and some amazing people in your life, you can probably do it because you've trained yourself essentially.
Right.
If you're like most of us, you need to train this. And I know it may, when I say training, it may sound like it's complicated or it takes a lot of time. It does not. Within days and weeks, you can see immense impact into your life by starting to shift perspectives, because there's always this idea, you touched upon it, that you're the victim, which means that something happens to you. And then there's the second idea where it's like, okay, so yes, you could say that something happens to you, but what if you flip that and say something happens for you? What good can you find in that negative that you just experienced? And I can guarantee you that if you start to sit down and ask questions, you can always find at least a few things that are positive in it. Lessons, doors that opened up. Like, you lost your job, that's very negative. But by losing your job, you get to spend more time with your kids or your family, and then a door opened up and you got a better job for your mental health, for your relationship, for whatever the case, right? But we always focus on the negative. And then there's a third level there, which you could say it's more spiritual, Doug, but it's essentially the level of how am I creating this or co-creating this, right? And so those are the three levels. I'm somewhere in between the second and third, where I'm like, Everything that happens in my life, I'm like, okay, how is this happening for me? Or how is this happening of my creation? And when you start looking at it that way, all of a sudden, so many more opportunities and doors open up.
Okay, and so we go back to that level of your dreams, and that really becomes a co-creation type of experience. So that's number 4, right? Is your dreams? All right, and what's number 5?
So number 5 is bringing it all together, because you see, you've now fortified your foundation. You keep building at it. You're very clear on who you are, so that's your why, your identity. You are very clear on your gifts and strengths, so you're amplifying on them. And you have a vision now that you want to work towards, right? To be it so you can get to it. So what's left? It's putting it all together and now start to look at your life and see, okay, well, we're implementing these things. We're integrating what's happening or what we've learned. So how is life happening for us? So we now start to apply things. We take a look at our life and say, okay, if my why is, in my case, to inspire and empower people on this journey, how much does it show up in my life? Is it show up in my work? Does it show up in my relationships at home and with my friends and family? If it doesn't, how can I bring more of it to the world? Same with my gifts and strengths. Am I spending 20% of my time on my gifts and strengths, or am I spending 5% or 50%? How can I increase that number? So as many things that I do actually come from a place of my why and come from a place of this is my gift or my strength. So I'll give you an example from my life to consolidate this for people. In 2023, at the beginning of 2023, when I was halfway through my journey, let's say, not halfway, because I mean, it never ends, but somewhere in the middle of the first 2 years of transformation, or towards the end of it, I should say, I started a podcast, because that was like, oh, that's how I'm going to deliver on my why. By being a high achiever, being someone that's always performed really well with many different things, and I'm a technical guy, I said, you know what? I'm going to learn how to edit the videos. I'm going to learn how to do both the audio and the video. I'm going to do shorts. I'm going to do all these amazing things, right, that I have never done before. And sure, it was not hard to learn, and I was doing it. But guess what, Doug? It was taking up, because I do 2 episodes a week, it was taking up 10 to 15 hours a week of my time, on top of my full-time job and other commitments. So here I am spending 10 to 15 hours a week on a weakness that was not my strength nor my gift. And what that meant, that I took away 10 to 15 hours from something that I could have put into like more psychology stuff, more talking or speaking or interviewing, because I love to do that stuff, any of the gifts and strengths I have. Now, when I realized that, of course, going through this process, I was like, now I can delegate that, buy myself some time. I buy myself 10 to 15 hours every week. And now I can put those 10 to 15 hours in what? Self-care. So meditation is a huge part of my life, spending more time with my dogs and my partner, and building my business, which resulted in exponentially, I can even say exponentially better results across all areas of life, from satisfaction to fulfillment to joy to success in business. And that's what I mean by this, is bringing it all together, because once you have the pieces, you got to put them together and make adjustments as you go, because you're a human being, life happens, but now you have the tools to not allow life to derail you too much.
You know, I've got a dozen more questions that we could go another hour, but we are getting close to that time. And this has been amazing. And I know that your podcast is called what, Unleash Thyself?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah, and you do that what, twice a week, or how does that work?
Yes.
Okay, and I love the whole purpose of that. I think that's great. So as we close, and you've really said so many things that are of such value, but if you could just put it into a shorter type of message for the audience, what would be the culmination message that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, Doug, I love that question, and it got me thinking, because, like you said, we talked about a lot of things. There's so many things we can say here, but I say one thing, and for those that can see this, they'll see it up there. I have a sign that says "Follow your heart," but to be able to follow your heart, you need to know what's in your heart. So I invite anyone listening to take a moment, take a deep breath in, and drop in and ask yourself what it is that I want to do with my life. And better yet, who do I want to be? Who am I? and let it sit, see what comes up. Because often enough, we don't ask enough questions. And when we do, we don't ask the right questions. And I promise you that if you start asking the right questions, you will get some amazing answers coming back from within, and your life will start to shift. And it's all about asking the right questions. Is this belief serving me? Is this thought coming up that I'm not good enough serving me?
Oh, I love it. I love it. and you know what's interesting is you do that, and as you mentioned, you love to meditate. So do I. As you go into as you work a little bit on meditation, and then ask those questions during your meditation state, that information comes up, which is just amazing. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. How do people find you, Constantin? How do they find you? What's your website?
Yeah, so the website, so a couple of things. If you want to connect with me personally, best thing is go to LinkedIn, where you'll see my profile. I post there regularly. That's Constantin with no E, Morun. Now, the websites are unleashthyself.com and calmsuccesslive.com. That's for my events, the ones I was talking about, where we go deep into my system and equip you with the tools to be successful in life. And of course, you can find us on social media across all platforms at Unleash Thyself or Constantin Morun.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has just been a great conversation. I appreciate it. And folks, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I've enjoyed it, and really that it's making a difference for you and perhaps giving you some thoughts on how you truly can become and uplift your life. So this is Dr. Doug saying namaste.